This week's tournament Tactician is going to be pretty light and breezy. There aren't any major tournaments happening this weekend, so I don't even have to cover lineups. It'll mostly just be me sort of talking about a couple of the minor changes to the tier list that I've made, and then next weekend, going into the seasonal tournament, we'll have a much bigger one. So this one's just kind of going to be like one of those small recap ones, but I still recommend that you watch it because there are some important updates to the tier list. If you are just looking to test this weekend, you know, maybe you want to test some of this stuff out. So in a 1,024 person, what is effectively a single elimination tournament, if you're looking to top, trying to pick on a singular deck is probably not an effective strategy unless the lineup that you craft also just has decent matchups across the board. Good luck with that one. What I do want to talk about are the decks that are probably going to be very popular going into this event, and I think Shen Fiora, Frostbite Midrange are going to be the two most popular. Back Alley Poker is a little bit of a question mark for me because the deck is very good and it's starting to really ramp up in popularity, but it's not the easiest deck in the world to play. It does have some glaring weaknesses, which is part of the reasons that Mist Wraiths has moved up to Tier 1. Unfortunately, still have not found a sample deck list for the Ionia version, but you get the gist. I am confident that at this point you know what Mist Wraiths look like, and this is the Targon list if you want to take a look at the sample, because the Targon is the much more popular version. Anyway, move Discard Aggro out of Tier 1 because it doesn't really pick on sort of the more popular decks of the format as well. Frostbite Midrange is sort of falling off as more people go for Anivia, things of that nature. Yes, you can run them both, but people just really not liking Frostbite Midrange, thinking it's a little bit too easy to pick on, not having as good a spread of matchups as you want it to, and yeah, it's probably going to beat Shen Fiora more often than not, but even that doesn't feel as one-sided as it should, on top of the fact that they can just ban your Frostbite Mid. I added in the Eclipse deck alongside the Leona Asoul, kind of dropped the Lux portion of that. I do think the Lux version is significantly weaker, as Mountain Scryer is a pivotal card for the deck right now, and Lux just generally can't afford to run that. I had mentioned in an earlier video that you can probably fit into effectively Targon Allegiance decks if you really want to, but I'm not sure if the considerations for cutting Leona from one of them really makes it worth it, especially since then the one with Leona in it is just that much more likely to get banned. I moved Targon Lee Sin up to Tier 1. I know that this has a really good Back Alley Poker matchup. Frostbite midrange is starting to fall off, and as we move towards a more mid-rangey / control type meta, I do think that Lee Sin is going to be a really good counter pick for this meta. Now, I had seen one player, and I believe it was the LBR, actually break out Taric Lee Sin rather than Zed Lee Sin, and if you'll remember, Taric recently got buffed up to having 3 attacks, so having that good effective fearsome blocker, as well as something that's a little bit hardier than the Zed in terms of survivability against something like Back Alley Poker, you know, it feels like Taric might be something worth looking into. I'm not willing to say that it should be your replacement for Zed for the time being, but I do think that the Ionia package right now is undeniably strong, and if you wanted to run a triple Ionia lineup and try to pick on something like Back Alley Poker, I think that's like a very reasonable thing. I don't know that Back Alley is specifically which one will be picking on there. You know, you would have to line up all of your Nopifies onto the first go hards and denies onto go hards and things like that, and then you also have to survive through their onslaught of smaller units, so you know, it's kind of a consideration, but I do think that Lee Sin is kind of like my sleeper pick going into this tournament, and it feels weird to call Lee Sin sleeper because some people probably don't even consider it sleeper. Some people thought it never fell off, and, you know, I just think that it's not seeing as much play as it used to. Obviously, I'm a big fan of the Eclipse and the Mono Targon, you know, stuff like that, but I do think that Lee Sin even has a pretty good matchup into things like that, just because there's not a lot of interaction, there's not a lot of removal. Your Lee Sin is going to stick, and it is going to stick forever. And I shuffled some stuff down to Tier 2, got rid of a couple of Tier 3 decks. I moved down the Draven Ezreal deck. As far as I've seen, this deck hasn't really impressed me. Generally, if you're not Progress Daying or Captain Farroning on 8, the win percentage of this deck goes way, way down. And it feels weird to need to find an on-curve on 8, and just, the Swain Ezreal is super in the gutter. This should actually probably be down in Tier 3. We're going to go ahead and move it down there right now, actually, because it just doesn't have nearly the draw power and the longevity that something like Draven Ezreal does. Accidentally overrode a deck there. And instead just gets hard blasted by things like the Targon decks that we're seeing pop up. And while Targon is good, I'm not sure that it's like so good that you can be committing a ban to it. If you are running an aggro lineup, then maybe, and actually that segues perfectly, because what I want to talk about are aggro lineups, because I moved Discard down into Tier 2, and I moved Mist Wraiths up into Tier 1. Part of the reason is that burn doesn't feel as good as board-based aggressive decks right now. If you've watched me before, generally I connotate burn with spells and aggro with units, and for a while burn has felt better, but now with the large amount of healing coming out of decks like the Shadow Isle decks, and even Back Alley Poker has a lot more healing than you would expect through kegged up Gohards and Doom Beasts, as well as all of the healing available to something like the Eclipse deck, it just feels like you need to maintain a board better in order to push through more damage in the long game rather than go for a burn type strategy, because there's not a lot of removal in the upper end of decks, right? I mean, Shen Fiora has a little bit, probably not enough to beat your board-centric aggro deck, especially if you're not running a lot of units that the Fiora can't just organically kill. If you're playing Fearsome, generally on turns 3 onward, everything that you're playing has 3 or more attacks, so it's going to take either concerted strikes or consistent barriers onto the Fiora in order to kill units like that. And there are still Spirit's Refuges popping up in the Shen Fiora, so you could just get blown out by a giant Spirit's Refuge onto a Brightsteel Greenglade Collector, Greenglade Caretaker if you are going for a burn type strategy, and it just feels like board centric is really the way to go. Pirate aggro has even been picking up a little bit more popularity over something like Discard, just because they do play the board a little bit better, because they have the Jack the Winners and the Gangplanks and sometimes even Captain Farron. Yes, there is still burn in the deck, but it's such a small amount, right? We're generally only seeing Decimate and Noxian Fervor as the spells in that deck. You're really, really unit heavy, and I feel like that's just got a better chance than something like Discard aggro going into this meta. And that's just a read that I have over the countless tournaments that I've watched and casted at this point, so if you disagree, that's totally fine. That's just kind of my perception of the aggressive meta that you would want going into a tournament like this, and that should make Frostbite midrange a little bit better, just because generally this beats the board-based decks but is weak to burn. So honestly, I think people are just... Frostbite gets exposed by way too many other things in the meta right now. It has a terrible Anivia matchup. It doesn't feel super great against the Eclipse decks, mostly because, and this feels weird just saying, it sounds really high-rolly, and you can believe me or you cannot, but actually I feel like Cosmic Inspiration just blows out certain matchups. And yeah, you know, Cosmic Inspiration has always done that, but with the amount of invoking that we're seeing out of the decks while still remaining consistent, I think that it's much more likely that they are going for that strategy in a lot more games than you would expect them to. And part of that is just because we're in a value-centric meta, because it's a very mid-range meta, you're not worried about dying all the time, you can go for more Travelers than you felt like you were previously allowed to. A lot of times your Solari Priestess had to get a Golden Sisters to try and survive against a couple of these decks, but now you can go for that Traveler, go for the value, even Traveler into Traveler, and just really dig for that Cosmic Inspiration. And I feel like you're going to find it in probably at least 30% of your games, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if we play 2 games, the chances of me finding it actually get pretty high at that point. Because 30% is, 1 out of every 3 games I'm going to find it. That's just math. But yeah, so essentially what we're looking at here is Frostbite midrange has started to fall off, and that means that we are moving more towards a meta that Frostbite midrange beats. With no tournaments this weekend, I don't think players are really going to get a chance to explore this meta on a public scale, so maybe Frostbite midrange does just sort of remain a good pick going into the seasonal tournament, because people are going to start to sort of make the same meta reads that I am here and decide that, yeah, Frostbite's falling off, we can go for other things, and then people that just didn't get the memo are still going to bring Frostbite. But that's all stuff that we can get into next week as we actually approach the seasonal tournament, when I have just a crumb more information on what decks are going to be good and stuff like that. For now, I just kind of wanted to give you how it looks like the meta is shaping up going into this last weekend before the seasonal tournament. So yeah, that does it for this week's Tournament Tactician. Like I said, it's going to be pretty light and breezy. I want to actually give a special thanks to all the Hearthstone players that are finally coming over to Legends of Runeterra for whatever reason they may have found. If you have found your way to my channel, that's absolutely great. I'm a caster. I do a lot of tournament-focused content. That's me. Speaking of casting, tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I'm going to have the Runeterra Chosen Ones Invitational alongside SJW. It's going to be on his Twitch channel, Shit Just Works. I'll link it down below. Tomorrow, Saturday, at about 9 a.m. EST, I am doing the top 8 of EU Masters, and then Sunday at the same time, I am doing, I guess, the top 4 and finals of EU Masters. And then on Monday, I will once again be back at 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time for the next week of the LBR. And for that, that's all it's going to do for me. My name is Boulevard, everybody. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.